All right, so we're going to be looking at domain and range. Domain and range isn't hard to understand. The most difficult part is getting the terminology right and writing it the exact way. Most students are able to understand this and say the answer, but as soon as it comes to writing it, there's like a couple tricky rules you have to go over. So, domain and range are basically a big list of all the possible x values in a relation. So, let's just look at a basic example just to see. If I had a graph here, let's say it's a basic graph, looks like that. Okay, that's my relation. The equation, actually let's draw it properly. Okay, y equals x, that's our equation. What we need to say, I want to say in this equation, what are all of the x values that are possible? So I could list them, right? It was like, well, 1, 2, 3, blah, 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 except in between 1 and 2, for the x values that are possible on this line, because of all the things in between. So instead, we could say like a range, right? We could say, oh, well, it's from 1 to 6, except as we can see from the arrowheads, it continues forever, which means it really goes to infinity. And then technically, it goes the other direction to the left forever as well. So it's from negative infinity to positive infinity. We don't really write it that way because it looks kind of weird. We're going to say that x is any number, which really makes a lot more sense. The way that we write it in math is this. Okay? X means x. This means is a set of, or part of the set of. So it's basically saying like x is an element of, x is part of what type of number. R means real numbers. Real number is literally any number you can imagine. So 3 is a real number, 2.5, 7 out of 11, pi. All of those are real numbers. I'm not going to go in all the different types of numbers, but the main ones you need to know is real numbers, and then integers, and then I guess like whole numbers. Okay, integers don't have decimals, so it's like 1, 2, 3, -1, 0, blah, blah, blah. Whole numbers is 0, 1, 2, anything positive. So we need to be able to say x is any real number. When we look at this graph, it also goes up and goes down forever. So when we say the range, we would say y is a set of all real numbers. If you want to do it the fancy math way with like the double line, that's fine. R is the basic idea. So that's the basic idea. There will be more complicated graphs, and let's do one right now. Okay, let's do this graph. So let's do the domain first. My x values, as we can see, it goes forever to the right. So it can be anything that is greater than 0. But we'll notice there's an edge. I like thinking of edges or limits or barriers or whatever, where the graph stops. That's an important number. So the x value where this graph stops is 0. So I'm going to write the 0. Okay? And we're talking about x, so I'm also going to write an x. Now I want to say the x values on the line, because that's what we're talking about. The domain we're talking about is whatever's on this line. These x values, are these numbers bigger or smaller than 0? They're bigger. So I'm going to say all the x numbers are bigger than 0. You could write it this way too, same idea. I also need to think, could x equal 0? Is that possible? When I look at my graph, right there, it could. So the way that we say greater than or equal to is like this. So these two things mean the same thing. 0 is smaller than or equal to x, but really the nicer way is to put the x first. X is greater than or equal to 0. That is my domain. The only thing I'm going to change about it though, I still don't know what type of numbers we're dealing with, so I'm going to write comma xer. So now I'm saying x is any real number, which basically whenever you have a line is true because it has all the decimals in between, and then we have x is greater than or equal to 0. Now, sometimes you'll see it written this way with the curly brackets, and there'd be an x like that. I'm not looking for all that detail. I'm okay with just this part, but when you see it written that way, that's what it's telling you. Curly brackets mean it's telling you all the information, and this is telling you which variable they're talking about in the domain. Now let's do the range. For this one, it's a little weird. Okay? The range is which y values are possible. So when you look at my graph, let's just pick a random point to start, this point right here. The y value at this point is 3. Actually, the y value at all the points is 3. So that's saying that the y value is always 3. So for this, for the range, I would just write y is equal to 3. That's it. There's no other possible answers. So I'm just going to say y equals 3. I don't need to say YER because there isn't a big list of numbers with decimals. There's just one answer. So that's the answer. The only other way that we could make this question a little harder, maybe if we put like a point here and a point here. Okay, what we'll notice, let's look back at the domain again. This point had a domain of 4, or an x of 4. This point had 5. Those two numbers fit within what we already wrote. So I don't need to like add them or list them different. Whereas the range of this point up here is 6, and it's 1 for the y's. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just list 1, 3, 6. Those are the three possible. Again, I don't need to do YER. I don't, because there's no decimals, there's no points in between, it's just those points. So that's a way to set those up. These are probably the most difficult ones you'll see, stuff that looks like this. And we can do that. Okay. I like to do the x's first. Actually, you know what? Let's just make it this way. Sorry about that. Okay. Let's do the domain first. So for my x values, I have 2 line segments. So I'm probably going to have 2 domains written. It's almost always the case unless they overlap. So if the line was like this, okay, they would be together as one. But so let's set these up as separate. So the first one, we got 2 barriers. There's an edge here and there's an edge here. So I'm going to list both those numbers, -4 and -2. The x numbers I'm caring about are in the middle, so it's going to look like that. Now what I have to decide, does it go this way, oops, or does it go this way? And we can just read it to try and understand. Is -4 greater than -2? It's not. It's more to the left. So this is actually wrong. It's this one. -4 is less than -2, and x is in between those two numbers. So -4 is smaller than x, and x is smaller than -2. So now that we've written that, we need to do the less than or equal to. So it could be equal to 2. So I'm going to put x is less than or equal to -2. Now the other thing we could look at is this point right here. See how it's that hollow circle, the white circle? That means it doesn't actually include that point. So we are going to say, we're just going to leave it as this symbol, the less than. When it's a black point, it means that it is included. If it's a white point, it means it's everything up until that number. So that is our first segment. Next, we're going to put a comma, and then we're going to do it for the next one. So again, we have 2 and everything bigger. So I'm going to say x is greater than 2, and it's a black dot, so it's greater than or equal to 2. That's our domain. The only thing I forgot, XER, because it has fractions in between all these points. Now let's do the range. Okay, again, we're looking at the up and down. So let's do this one first. The range there, y is just 1. At all of the points along this line, it's always equal to 1. Even though this is a hollow point, so technically it's not 1 there, it is 1 at all these points beside it, which means that 1 is included on our graph. Then I'm going to put a comma, and I'm going to put a equation for this one. For these points, I have y, it's going up forever. So I know that there's no limit there, but there's a limit here at 2. So I'm going to put 2 and y. These y numbers are bigger than 2, so I'm going to do that. It's a solid dot, so I'm going to say equal to as well. The last thing I need to do, YER, and that's my answer. So these types of questions aren't complicated if you think about it and try and say it. The hard part is actually writing it in the proper form, which just takes practice. What I recommend doing is when you do these questions think about each part and try and just say it in your head. Well, at this part, the x values are between -4 and -2, but it can't equal 0, or -4. So then you write it, and it turns into that. If it helps, write it out in English, like as a sentence first, and then try and translate that into these equations. And that's it.